Okay. So, good morning, everybody. I'm Owen Parker, head of the EU ETS team in DECC. This morning I wanted to say a few things. I wanted to talk a little bit about Phase 3, just some of the changes we're going to see, a little bit of the timetable that we've still got to go. But I think I'm probably going to focus most on the sorts of things that Trevor was just picking up. So a bit about the state of the system, a bit about the kind of proposals, the legislative proposals that are now on the table, perhaps to strengthen the system. And I thought I'd do a little bit of musing about where we think the ETS might go from here as well. But just to start, before I get into the problems, I mean, just remembering that we're about to start Phase 3, it'll start the 1st of January 2013, and Phase 3 sees quite a lot of changes to the system intended to strengthen the system as we see it. So we're setting an EU-wide top-down cap in line with our climate targets, so sort of intended to achieve a 21% reduction in emissions by 2020 across the EU ETS sectors as part of delivering 20% reduction overall for the EU by 2020. This is a big step away from the sort of bottom-up member state-led cap setting process we've seen before this. There's the inclusion of new sectors, new gases, sort of aspects of the chemical industry. You've got nitrous oxide coming in, but you also have the aviation sector, the biggest single expansion in the system, which came in from January this year, but forms a part of Phase 3 as well. There's a big move to the way we're allocating allowances, a move towards auctioning as a more efficient way of doing it. Approximately 50% of allowances in the ETS will be auctioned from January. At the moment, it's about 7% of allowances, and, you know, for example, the power sector will receive all of its allowances through auctions. There'll be none allocated for free at all. There's a big step up in actually harmonising the way the system works. The rules on giving out allowances for free will be harmonised, so all member states are doing it off the same basis. The monitoring and reporting and verification equally is sort of a more harmonised set of rules to make sure we have a kind of more consistent system overall. Again, as part of the tightening, there's a sort of limit on the use of project credits. This is both sort of quantitative limits and also that we're bringing in certain restrictions on particular types of project credits considered to be less environmentally sound, I suppose. I mean, this gives rise, I think, to some of the issues that Trevor was talking about with the CDM, but is also important if you're trying to deliver a certain level of environmental ambition through the system. And then there are certain common infrastructural effects, and the Union Registry is one. I know that's the next session here, but I mean, it's a big step forward from having member states responsible for registries, responsible for security, to one commonly held registry with higher levels of security overall. And just a brief sort of sense of what's coming up implementation-wise. I mean, most of the implementation is in place. At this stage, we're in the kind of very nuts and boltsy side of things, issuing operators with permits, making sure that's in place, making sure the legal framework is in place with new regulations aiming to simplify the system for the operators that are in it. Of interest probably to you will be that we start Phase 3 auctions in November. We're sort of mid-November should be the first UK auction, and the European Commission and Germany will be auctioning from, well, the end of this month is the intention. At an EU level, we're still waiting on the European Commission to actually approve both the UK's allocations to installations, but also other member states' allocations to installations. At the point that they do that, we will have a sense of what the sort of full levels of free allocation are across the EU, and sort of whether or not we need to bring in things like the cross-sectoral correction factor, which will potentially reduce installation level allocations or not. These are things we're expecting to know before the end of this year, and they, in a sense, pave the way for issuing allocations, which start in February 2013. The first Phase 3 allocations will go out. I think the final things to say about implementation at this stage, we're negotiating further amendments to the registry regulations, and I mean those, among other things, will set down the proper procedures, for example, for exchange of CERs from Phase 2 into Phase 3 allowances, so setting out the procedures for any operators holding those project credits. Likewise, we're expecting, though we have yet to see, proposals from the European Commission setting out precisely how the quantitative restrictions on project credits will work, so exactly what the levels of access operators will have to project credits in phase 3 of the ETS. But the basic picture is that we are virtually there. We're pretty much ready to start in January 2013. So, I mean, kind of moving to the issue of the day, as Trevor says, you know, the state of the ETS has been talked about an awful lot. When we agreed the outlines of the system and the package back in 2008, nobody was really expecting a recession, and what might have looked like a tough cap setting process in 2008 no longer looks quite the same. You know, even for phase 2, the recession has led to reduced growth, obviously, and that's reduced emissions. Those emissions have not really recovered in the year since. When you combine that with a pretty strong growth in the use of project credits, whether CDM or JI project credits, what you end up with is a system in which allocations and the use of credits is far outweighing the level of emissions we're actually seeing in the system, and we've been gradually, among industrial installations at least, there's been a surplus of allowances building up within the system. Now, these figures, which come from the most recent report the European Commission have done on this, show that even by 2011, the level of the surplus sort of accumulated just over phase 2 is getting on for 1 billion allowances, so it's 1 billion megatons of surplus carbon sitting in the system. The forecast that they're making is that by the end of phase 2, so the end of this year, that surplus is going to look like something of the order of 1.7 billion allowances, so 1.7 gigatons of carbon. And, you know, this is a picture that varies a little across the sectors, but I mean, if you look at some of the sectors, such as, you know, the sort of pig iron and steel sector, we're talking about surpluses in the range of sort of 360 megatons developed so far. Cement, clinker and lime, you're talking about 260 odd megatons of carbon surplus. So that's, in a sense, allocation in excess of emissions in those sectors, and they're just sitting on large piles of allowances. It's not the case across the whole bit, so the combustion sector is actually fairly short over the same period. And so this just is confirming the situation as it goes ahead. You know, even you can see the red line, which is the surplus building up all the way up to sort of the end of this year. As phase 3 comes in, the tighter cap does start to kick in, and that sort of growth in the surplus is dropping off as sort of allocations, as sort of closer allocations, project credits and what have you are closer to emissions, but you're never getting the kind of scarcity that is actually eroding that surplus over the course of phase 3. So what we see, if we leave the situation roughly as it is a continued large surplus of allowances continuing over the course of phase 3. And again, you know, this comes out in particular sectors where you see, for example, if you look across phase 3 at the likely projections of emissions versus the allocation, you see that sectors like cement and lime have approximately something 140% allocation over the whole of phase 3. You have the metal sector sort of somewhere close to 100%. So I mean, this is saying you have industrial sectors not needing to buy any allowances at all over phase 3. And if you're looking at that in terms of the incentives as we are for investing in abatement or investing in the kind of technology that's going to reduce emissions, I mean, there's no incentive there at all if your free allocation covers the entirety of your compliance need. So, I mean, that's broadly the situation, and as Trevor mentioned, this feeds through, obviously, to the carbon price, and it's lower, it's down at something like €8 from a high of 30 odd euros earlier in the phase. I suppose some of that positive number we assume to be a reaction to the kind of proposals that we've seen recently from the Commission, so I'll say something about that. I mean, I think we sort of assume some of that positive price is just an expectation that actually the European Union is going to do something to address this situation of surplus, and the Commission has put some proposals down on the table. I mean, broadly, it's a sort of split between some short-term proposals, which are about backloading the allowances. The basic idea the Commission has here is to change the profile of the auctions that are going to take place over phase 3, so that you take allowances that might have been auctioned early in the phase, in the first few years, 2013, 2014, 2015, and you take some of those out and you auction them towards the end of the phase, either in the last 3 years, possibly in the final year of the phase. Now, the idea there being, if you were just to look at the measure on its own, the idea is to just remove some of the excess supply in the market in the early years of the phase and move it towards the end of the phase, where the cap will have already been declining a certain amount. The situation is a little tighter, so you're sort of spreading that surplus, if you like, over phase 3. And that, in a sense, is a sort of short-term view of bolstering the price. Now, the way they've done this is slightly complicated. There are 2 measures on the table. The first is a co-decision amendment to the ETS Directive. There's certainly some questions about whether the Commission actually has the legal powers to do this backloading of allowances. The Commission themselves may not feel that they need or may feel that they already have those powers, but certainly some have questioned it, and in order to head off any legal challenge, the Commission has decided to clarify that absolutely, so they are making an amendment to the ETS Directive that makes it very clear that they do have the powers to change the auction schedule in that way. And then the second proposal is a legislative proposal that actually changes the auction schedule itself and sets up this backloading. Now, the first is obviously co-decision, so it is with both the European Parliament and the Council to decide upon at the moment. The second is a comitology amendment, which means member states decide on it by qualified majority, and then while it goes to the European Parliament for approval, it's essentially a yes-no vote for the European Parliament. Longer term, the situation is a little more vague. Everybody in July was expecting a third element to this package, which would have been a report on the state of the carbon market by the European Commission, and in that we were expecting to see discussion of what they call structural measures, so long-term changes in addition to the backloading, for example, proposals around cancellation or in some way tightening the ETS cap in a permanent way. That we are expecting now sometime in mid-November, but we didn't see it when we were first expecting it. Sort of more broadly, and I'll come on to discuss this a little more later, there are questions about whether the rules for phase 4 may be one of the ways in which the Commission seek to address this, or whether setting the right 2030 target is a way of addressing it, basically setting out a trajectory for the future which is rather tighter than the trajectory up to 2020, as a way of, in the long term, removing some of that surplus from the system. And I think I was asked to say a little bit about what the UK government's position is. I think in order to do that, we just need to start from what we see as the objectives of the system. Largely, the ETS gets seen as a volume-based measure where fundamentally what the ETS is about is reducing emissions to a certain predetermined level. That's obviously something we agree with, and it's something we've always thought is core to the ETS, which for us has been core to climate policy, both for the UK and across the EU. But in the end, it becomes more complicated than that. And I mean, we want to see a system which not only sets an ambitious emissions reduction target, but in doing that, we want to see a system that sends the right signal for abatement now and in the future, and that provides the right kind of signal for investment in low carbon generation. And it's not been clear that the politics have always been there to enable the cap to be set in such a way that does actually do all of those things at the same time. So I think the other part of the context is always worth thinking is the UK government has been a strong supporter of greater ambition across the EU. So we have been campaigning for a 30% target for emissions reduction by 2020 rather than the 20% target that we have currently. And in line with these kind of aspirations in the UK ourselves, we've put in place measures like the UK carbon price floor, which, while not part of the ETS, nevertheless sends essentially a price signal out to generators in the absence of a stronger EU ETS price signal. So what that translates to, in terms of our position, is basically a preference for a longer-term solution than the one that the Commission has put on the table. In principle, we'd rather have a system that was set up right, that had the correct cap, and that was sending these signals, and we'd rather a system in which we didn't have to intervene at all. But in this instance, I think we have to intervene. That said, if we're going to be intervening, we want to minimise the uncertainty for the market, for investors, for everybody else, and on that basis we'd prefer this to be a one-off intervention. But as a one-off intervention, we don't think backloading takes you far enough. All it really does is move allowances from one part of the phase to another part of the phase. It doesn't address the level of the cap. It doesn't fundamentally address the level of the surplus in the system. Now, you know, one reading of the backloading proposal is it's a first step which just provides the time to secure a better outcome for the cap, and so we can have a certain level of sympathy with that. But really, if you're going to go as far as amending the ETS directive, as the Commission now are, our preference would be to see that amendment used to just take one step and cancel the allowances that we think we need to remove from the market straight away. And I think when we're talking about what sort of volume you need to address here, our starting point is trying to ensure that we start phase 3 with as little hangover from phase 2 as you can manage. I said earlier that the estimation of the surplus by the end of phase 2 is something of the order of 1.7 billion megatons. Now, you know, the Commission has put on the table 3 options between 400 million allowances and 1.2 billion allowances. None of those, to our mind, seem to be quite high enough, and so we've been pushing the Commission for a higher number, starting somewhere around 1.7 billion and seeing where we get. I mean, there's got to be a reality check about whether we'll get that, but that's broadly the UK position. We want essentially significant action which actually addresses the existing surpluses, that it's one-off and makes an actual change. And I've just put a table here which is some of our analysis of just what we think the impacts of those would be. And, you know, with the 1.7 billion allowances taken out of the system, and we're sort of predicting possibly a sort of price jump in the order of sort of 20 odd euros. You know, all modelling has its pluses and its minuses, so that's a sort of indicative figure, but nevertheless it's saying we would see a substantial change in the system if we were actually able to take out that volume of surplus. Now, just looking at the kind of timetable we have, as I said, I mean, you have 2 proposals, a co-decision proposal and a comitology proposal. The Council is discussing both of those. The European Parliament is only discussing the proposal for amending the directive. Within the Council, I mean, there is pretty broad support for taking action, and all of this kicked off with an informal ministers' meeting back in April or May, where, you know, every single member state said there was a need for action. And I mean, every single member state, not all of them agreed on what the precise form of action should be, but all member states, including those who are often seen to be at the sort of, I suppose, the holding back end of all of this, were saying something needed to be done for the ETS. So there is broad support for action, and even for the proposals on the table there is broad support for action, but I think most member states want to see this in its context. They don't want to see backloading on its own. They want to know where backloading is taking you. Is it taking you towards some kind of structural reform of the ETS or not? There are a lot of questions within the Council about this, the overlap between the amendment to the ETS directive and the auctioning regulation. If the amendment to the directive is supposed to give the Commission the power to do this, then surely you might have to have that come first, and then an amendment to the auction regulation later. But then that suddenly becomes a very slow process of strengthening the system. So I mean, that's an open question. And then for many member states, obviously the impacts this is going to have on industry, who will be facing a higher carbon price and potentially higher costs, and also for some member states the impact this is going to have on their revenues coming out of auctioning, and whether this is positive or negative. These are kind of critical questions in the debate, but in a broad sense I think the Council's in favour. The European Parliament position is more complicated. Certainly the major groups are split. The centre-right European People's Party has come out as a grouping against this. There's support from the ALDE groups, that's the Liberals and the Greens, and that's sort of broadly balancing against each other. The net result of this kind of slightly split position is that the chair of the Environment Working Group, who is the person leading the discussions in the European Parliament on this, has chosen to take a very slow timetable, allowing a lot of time for discussion, a lot of time for members to sort of get in experts and see views. And you know, that makes suddenly, if we get back to this idea of whether you have to have an amendment to the directive before you could have the auction regulation amendment, it makes the whole timetable quite slow, and suddenly you're talking about late 2013 perhaps before even any backloading is agreed. This is all quite open stuff, but it potentially leaves us in a difficult place. And as I say, we're expecting a report from the Commission in November on longer-term structural change. Let's see where that takes us and where that discussion goes, because really, as I say, for a lot of member states, where that discussion is going is pretty critical to how they're going to view any proposals on the table on backloading. So finally, just I wanted to say a little bit about where the system's going to go. There are, as ever, a range of potential changes coming up. We start with certain reviews which were set down in the ETS Directive. In 2014, there'll be a review of carbon leakage status. So carbon leakage status determines for many industrial installations the levels of free allocation they're going to get. This review is pretty narrow in scope, but nevertheless there are factors to look at, and that this review could end up in changes where potentially some sectors may be getting getting less allocation than they are at present. I mean, we'll need to see where that goes. More fundamental reviews will come later. There's an ongoing question about whether the maritime sector may join. At the moment, the European Commission is talking about developing an EU-wide standard, but there is discussion about including international maritime as a sector within the ETS, much as aviation has been included to date, and real questions about how that's done, whether that creates excess demand. As I've said, you know, we're going to have a discussion at some stage on structural reform. Either that's going to come out of the current proposals on the table, or it's going to come out of a negotiation over what Phase 4 should look like, or, as I'm pretty sure that Commissioners Hedegaard and Oettinger are keen to do, there may well be a launch of a discussion around what the 2030 climate and energy package ought to look like, and that could start as early as next year. In any of these, the ETS and the shape of the ETS is going to be a key part of that discussion, because it's 50% of the contribution to EU climate targets. And within that, we'll be talking about the level of the cap. We'll be talking about what levels of access we'll have to project credits, both what type of project credits, whether we tighten up that access with more ambition. Price support, by which I mean alongside setting a cap, do we actually need something to try and assure a certain level of the price going forward? That wouldn't be how you'd set it up if you had a pretty purist approach to the system, but some of the problems we've seen today raise real questions about whether you need carbon price floors, a central carbon bank, auction reserve prices that actually end up cancelling allowances, for example. There are questions about regulation. There will be questions about competitiveness. Like, do we take a more fundamental look at carbon leakage? Do too many sectors have carbon leakage status? Are we still giving out too much free allocation to industrial sectors? Could we be targeting it better? Questions about expansion to new sectors, and I mean, again, we'll always be looking at where does the demand for allowances come. Areas like heat, surface transport are being talked about, and then a general move towards consistency and implementation, making sure that what one member state is doing is precisely the same as another. I think the final thing I just want to say something quickly about was international linkages. Again, as a source of demand, there's talk right now about linking with Australia. One-way linking is being talked about for 2015, two-way linking by 2018. I mean, here's potentially a way in which you're expanding the ETS quite significantly, bringing in new areas of demand into the system. Let's see where that goes with others like Korea, the pilots in China, God knows one day, America. That would be the dream. Thank you. That's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but.
Yes.